The House Judiciary Committee has announced it will review reports that the White House in 2003 ordered the CIA to forge and disseminate false intelligence documents linking al-Qaeda and Iraq. The CIA forged a letter from the head of Iraqi intelligence to Saddam Hussein. It was backdated July 1st, 2001, and stated 9/11 ringleader Mohammed Atta was trained for his mission in Iraq. This is an allegation reported in an explosive new book out last week by Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Ron Suskind. It is called The Way of the World, a story of truth and hope in an age of extremism. The book alleges the Bush administration had learned months before the war from the former head of Iraqi intelligence that Iraq had no weapons of mass destruction. But he was paid $5 million, and the CIA forged a letter from him to convince Americans that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction was linked to al-Qaeda. House Judiciary Committee Chair John Conyers said he was, quote, troubled by the claims in the book, and that his staff would, quote, conduct a careful review of Mr. Suskind's allegations and the role played by senior administration officials in this matter. The White House, former CIA Director George Tenet, the former CIA officials who are Suskind's sources have all flatly denied the claims in the book. Ron Suskind, the author of The Way of the World, joins me here in our Firehouse studio for the hour. Welcome to Democracy Now! It's not only the House Judiciary Committee, but also the Senate Intelligence Committee, Select Committee on Intelligence, is also saying they will investigate?
Absolutely, yeah. It's interesting because there's been a push and shove this week with actually sort of non-denial denials, if you look carefully at what the various folks involved have said. There's a lot of pressure that's being brought to bear on certainly all the participants. The book is full of on-the-record comments from actual participants. It's essentially not my claim. It's people involved talking about what they did and when in terms of the letter. And that's why some of them have felt real heat. Obviously, this could end with a constitutional crisis, and their testimony is central to that.
Well, let's step back for a minute. Why don't you lay out your allegations?
Yeah. Here's what happened, this sort of tale of Habush. He is the Iraqi intelligence chief currently for Saddam Hussein at the time we're marching to war. What the book shows with great clarity from many, many off-the-record sources, as well as those who are speaking on the record for attribution, is that coming through 2002, the case for war was a rickety structure, and I show exactly how that occurred. They knew a great deal prior to the start of 2003 about how hollow the case for WMD was inside the administration. In January of 2003, the United States and the UK, Britain, set up a secret back channel with the current head of Iraqi intelligence who slips out of Baghdad and starts meeting with us in Amman, Jordan. It's an extraordinary high-risk mission. The British intelligence official is the lead man. He's meeting with Habush, is the name of the Iraqi.
This is Richard Dearlove?
No, this is a fellow named Michael Shipster, who's the head of the Mideast for British intelligence. Of course, the reports flow instantly up to the White House and to Downing Street, and right off the bat, Habush says there are no WMD. He, in fact, has great credibility here. He, as the intelligence chief, runs the biological program. He talked about it being closed down. He went through letter and verse on all of the other various allegations of WMD. And as well, Amy, he said something fascinating. He talked about the mind of Saddam Hussein. All of this, of course, would be shown to be true publicly, rather grandly later, but that Saddam was fearful of the Iranians, he explained to us. You know, he doesn't think the United States would ever want to invade a country like Iraq. You guys have already made that decision. And Islamic radicalism, the big threat, that's not here. He was afraid of showing the Iranians, whose nascent nuclear program he knew was ramping up, that he had no weapons, that he was a toothless tiger, so-called. That was his fear, of course, all of which explains his behavior, all of which was briefed up the ranks through the White House starting in early January of 2003. Interestingly, when the president first hears that Habush, our secret source, is saying there are no WMD, he says, well, why don't you tell him to give us something we can use to make our case? That's his first reaction. Of course, as the briefing moves forward, there's great consternation because the case for war now, well, that structure, that rickety structure, has essentially fallen over. What do we do in February when the final report is delivered? George Tenet briefs it to the president, the vice president, Condi Rice. As he walks down, he says they're not going to like this downtown, he says to one of his aides. Of course, they don't. At that point, though, we have a relationship.
George Tenet.
George Tenet briefs it to the president. And at that point, interestingly, we have a relationship with this man, Habush, who has been in on this high-risk mission, and we've agreed to resettle him. All right, well, the fact is we invade Baghdad. Baghdad falls. Habush gets out to a safe house in Amman, Jordan, as according to plan. And then during that spring and summer of 2003, as it becomes clear to all the world what the White House was briefed earlier, that there are no weapons, of course, this Habush character becomes, let's just say, radioactive inside of the White House. What are we going to do with Habush? And as one of the key CIA officials says, that, and of course the White House has denied none of this, and they certainly, you know, they can't deny any of this, is that everyone was terrified that Habush would pop up on the screen during that summer of Joe Wilson and Valerie Plame. At that point, we dotted the I's and crossed the T's on his deal and agreed to pay him $5 million.
Who agreed?
The White House, the administration. It's the United States government pays him $5 million. At this point, even those inside of CIA say it can only be considered hush money because we didn't use him for anything. You know, the CIA was saying, look, he's an expert in Iraq, go talk to him. But of course, as the summer progressed, he's the last person the White House wants to talk to. But come fall of 2003, they come up with some way he might be useful. And that's when the genesis of this letter clearly emerges. I have it dated around September because people involved recall exactly where they were. And the White House orders the CIA to have a letter fabricated from Habush to Saddam, as you said, backdated July 2001, which solves all of the White House's political problems. As one person at CIA said, it was a check the box for all of the White House's yawning political nightmares at that period. At that point, of course, they're being accused of going to war under false pretenses, an enormous historical charge. The letter pops up just as planned. The mission is carried through, and everyone sees it, roiling the global news cycles. Tom Brokaw goes on and Meet the Press about it. William Safire writes about it in the New York Times. CNN, of course, O'Reilly flogs it for 4 days straight. That is illegal. It is illegal for the CIA to run disinformation campaigns on the United States. It is against CIA statutes and amendments. That's why we have such a crisis right now. Certainly the White House does, because this is the kind of illegality that, frankly, they've dodged up to now. At this point, the evidence is clear, and they can't dodge it.
Ron Suskind, you described the role of Con Coughlin, the reporter from the London Sunday Telegraph, who obtained the forged CIA letter. He was interviewed on NBC's Meet the Press in December of 2003, shortly after he published an article based on the forged letter. Let me play an excerpt.
It's an intelligence document written by the then head of Iraqi intelligence, Habush, to Saddam. It's dated the 1st of July 2001, and it's basically a memo saying that Mohammed Atta has successfully completed a training course at the house of Abu Nidal, the infamous Palestinian terrorist who, of course, was killed by Saddam a couple of months later. Now, this is the first really concrete proof that al-Qaeda was working with Saddam.
Who's Con Coughlin?
He's a foreign correspondent for the Daily Telegraph of London.
And his significance in being the one to put out this letter?
He's, let's just say, someone friendly with the administration, a neocon favorite.
Talk about what happened next.
Well, interestingly, what happens next in terms of the letter is it pops up, again, just as intended. But interestingly, I think the thing that undermines the letter after a week or so is people say, my goodness, that's an awful lot in one letter, solving so many of the White House's problems all at once. And I think that's ultimately what undermines the letter's credibility going forward. People say, it just doesn't smell right. And Newsweek reporters started to dig in. And generally the sense, even though the letter popped up again later, generally the sense was that this doesn't seem quite right. This is probably a forgery.
Let me go to some of the responses to your explosive allegations, like the former CIA Director George Tenet. He says the second nugget in the book involves a supposed order from the White House to me at the CIA to have my staff fabricate a letter connecting Iraq with al-Qaeda and the attacks of 9/11. Suskind says that CIA was directed to get an Iraqi official to copy the bogus information in his own hand and then cause it to be leaked to the media. There was no such order from the White House to me, nor, to the best of my knowledge, was anyone from CIA ever involved in any such effort. The notion that I would suddenly reverse our stance and have have created and planted false evidence that was contrary to our own beliefs is ridiculous. Those the words of George Tenet.
The key line in there is the "to best of my recollection." I mean, Tenet, of course, has had problems up to now. I dealt with him a great deal on my last book, The 1% Doctrine. The reason reporters don't call George up to now is because he says, essentially, he doesn't remember slam dunk. He doesn't remember briefing the president before 9/11. I've known George for a long time. What I did hear as I talked to the direct participants who actually executed, were involved in the step-by-step of the process, and they testify on the record in the book. And I think people in the know, certainly in Washington, understand why George is the last man you want to call on something like this.
I want to talk about Robert Richer and John McGuire. Robert Richer, former head of CIA's Near East Division, former